Okay, many thanks to Professor Han for his opening address. And since we have a tight schedule this morning, I think it's better that we start the first session now. And our first speaker is Professor Dirk Perboom. And I think for people who work on free will and moral responsibility, Professor Perboom needs no recommendation. He part a lot in this field. He's a leading figure in discussions on free will and agency and moral responsibility. His publications, including books like Living Without Free Will and Free Will Agency and Meaning in Life. And the most recent one, Wrongdoing and the Moral Emotions. So now please join me to welcome Professor Perboom to give us the first talk. Okay.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. It would have been much nicer to be in Beijing itself, of course, but this is second best and it's still wonderful. So I want to give you an outline of my most recent argument for skepticism about free will, for the denial that we have free will. I'll do that, and at the end I'll try to answer the following question, which I've been trying to answer for 25 years. Is it really possible for us to live good lives without the conception of ourselves as free in the sense that I have in mind? Now, there are many different senses of free will in the discussion, and I think some of them are pretty uncontroversial. For example, Descartes in the Meditations at a certain point suggests that free will, he's got many definitions going in that work, but one of them is a certain kind of rationality in action. And traditionally free will has been associated with that, but there's very few people that want to deny that we have free will in the sense of rationality in action. So I think that in the last 50 years or so, there have been two notions of free will that have been contested. So one is the ability to do otherwise. So on the occasion of an action, suppose you perform an action of a certain sort. The question then arises, could you have refrained from performing that action at that time? And one feature of the universe that might put that supposition in jeopardy is causal determinism. So the question is the universe causally deterministic? Or is the universe such that the past history of the universe, together with the laws of nature, render every subsequent event inevitable? And if that's the case, then you might wonder if we really have the ability to do otherwise on a particular occasion. But I think that in the last maybe 25 years or so, the notion of free will that's been most hotly contested isn't the notion of being able to do otherwise, but rather it's the control condition, the control in action required for us to be morally responsible in some particular sense. Okay? And what's that sense? Well, the question is, do we ever deserve pain or harm for the wrongs that we knowingly do? And is it ever the case that we deserve pleasure or benefit for the good things that we do? And you might think that if the universe is deterministic, those suppositions are also cast into doubt. And I want to focus on the negative part of it. Okay? So the question there is it ever the case that because of our knowingly doing wrong, we deserve to be blamed or punished in a way that we would experience as painful or harmful? And I'm thinking that that notion of desert is basic in the sense that it doesn't have a deeper justification. It's just kind of a fundamental moral fact about the universe. So there are notions of desert that are in turn founded on forward-looking considerations like utilitarian considerations or contractualist considerations. So Ben Vilhauer, for example, argues that there is such a thing as deserved pain or harm for wrongdoing, but it's based on a social contract, the kind of social contract that the philosopher John Rawls explicated. Okay, so what I'm saying is that the notion of free will that's most hotly contested in the debate these days is whether we have the control and action required for attributions of basic desert, and especially the negative ones, right? The pain and harm that's allegedly deserved for knowingly having done wrong. Okay, so you might worry that this casts morality into jeopardy, and we'll discuss that in more detail soon. But besides these, other than this backward-looking notion of moral responsibility, one that involves basically deserved pain or harm, there are also forward-looking notions of responsibility. So, for example, a mother might blame a child when the child knowingly does wrong, not because she believes that the child basically deserves pain or harm, but rather because she believes that it's her duty, given her position, to morally educate the child. So blame in that kind of circumstance might not have the objective of giving the child what he or she deserves, but rather the objective of moral education. And moral education, or moral formation, is a forward-looking goal, by contrast with the backward-looking goal of seeing to it that wrongdoers get what they deserve, and in particular, get what they basically deserve. Okay, so in the end, I want to argue that we don't have the control and action required for the sort of free will, which is the control, condition, and action required for basic desert, but that leaves forward-looking moral responsibility on the table. And in fact, I want to affirm that that's the kind of moral responsibility we in fact have. So my argument against our having free will of this sort involves arguments against the two positions that claim that we do have the control and action required for true basic desert attributions. And those positions are, first of all, libertarianism, and secondly, compatibilism. Okay? In fact, our next speaker, Carolina Sartoro, is going to defend compatibilism, but I'm going to give you an argument against it, which she actually replies to in her 2017 book. So, but first of all, libertarianism. So libertarians are concerned about the dilemma posed by determinism for free will. And what libertarians have traditionally argued is that determinism is in fact false, right? And it's the falsity of determinism that allows us to have free will in the contested senses, in the sense of the control condition on moral responsibility, and also in the sense of being able to do otherwise. Okay, I'm going to give you a kind of thumbnail sketch of my arguments against the two main sorts of libertarianism. One is event causal libertarianism, and the other is agent causal libertarianism. Now, event causal libertarianism, along with a lot of people who think scientifically about the universe, at least maybe this was the paradigmatic kind of scientific model for causation in the mid to late 20th century. The idea is that all causation takes place by means of events. So the first relatum in a causal relation is always an event, such as an event might have the following structure: a substance or a thing having a particular property at a time. So Anne's having the belief that giving to charity is good at a particular time, that's an event that has the potential to cause an action of hers. Okay, now this contrasts with the substance causal picture, according to which the first relatum in a causal relation may be a thing or a substance, and first relata in causal relations aren't restricted to events. Okay, but the most popular view of causation among scientifically minded people in the last 50 years or so has been the event causal model. So I want to argue that on the event causal model of libertarianism, agents don't have the control and action required for the sort of moral responsibility at issue. Now, why is that? Well, Thomas Nagel argued that if the only causal relations, if the first relation, if the first element in any causal relation is an event, then agents or persons fall out of the universe. Okay? And I want to give you an argument to that effect, which I call the disappearing agent argument. So we might imagine that an agent is contemplating two courses of action. So in Robert Kane's example, we have an agent, a businesswoman, who's faced with the following dilemma. She's going off to work and she wants to be at work on time because her boss gets annoyed when she's late. But on the way to work, she sees a crime in an alley. Somebody is assaulted by somebody else, and the victim requires help. So at this point, she has moral reasons to stop and help, and she's got self-interested reasons to speed on to work. And suppose she's considering both, and suppose in the end, the moral reasons win out, and she decides to stop and help. Now, imagine that the only causation in the universe is by way of events. So in this situation, we have the following situation that you can imagine that on the one hand, her desire, her moral desires, right, her desire to help the victim at T, which can be construed as an event, and her desire to make it to work on time at T. Those are the two competing causes for this particular action. Now, in the event causal libertarian picture, the only causes in the world are events. So we can imagine that the only relevant causes in this situation are these two desire events. But the libertarian also wants to say that causation is indeterministic. So neither event, right, neither of these two desire events is going to causally determine the action. So neither event is going to settle which of the two possible actions, stopping and helping or speeding off to work, occurs. Okay, but the problem with event causal libertarianism is that there isn't anything that can break the tie, right? Or at least there's nothing about the agent that can break the tie. And hence, we have what I call the disappearing agent objection. In a situation in which we want the agent to exercise control in the situation, the agent can't exercise control because all the causation that the agent is involved in these cases is by way of these desire events. Okay, so now at this point you can, this is why agent causation has been so attractive to libertarians, because at this point we can say that agents have the basic power, an agent causal power, to, as substances, settle which of these two possible events occurs. Okay, so that's the agent causal libertarian picture. And because it's libertarian, it's also indeterministic. So on the libertarian picture, which is affirmed in the history of philosophy by, say, Immanuel Kant, agents have the power as substances to cause actions without being causally determined to cause them, and thereby to settle which of two possible actions occurs in one of these forced choice situations. Okay, so what's the problem with agent causal libertarianism? Well, the question that Immanuel Kant raised for what he called transcendental freedom, his name for agent causal libertarianism, is whether the agent causal picture can be reconciled with the laws of nature. And he thought of the laws of nature as deterministic laws, right? And that was common in the period. There's a very famous quote from the French physicist and mathematician Laplace to the effect that the universe is deterministic. So you can imagine a demon, an omniscient demon who can, on the basis of his knowledge of the past and the laws, can predict every future occurrence. Okay, so, but the problem is this. First of all, if the laws are deterministic, how can agents be indeterministic in the way that agent causation requires? Well, maybe there are two possibilities. One is that agents aren't physical beings and hence aren't governed by the physical laws. So that's the dualist or the idealist possibility. Another possibility is that the physical is in the end indeterministic. And I mentioned that in Kant's day and in the 18th century and also in the 19th century, physicists typically thought of the laws governing the physical world as deterministic laws. But the advent of quantum mechanics in the 20th century opens the door, at least a bit, to an indeterministic interpretation of the laws of physics. So I don't want to get into the details of quantum mechanics, but the key question concerns the wave function equation. So the predictions it makes are, fabulous. There are no known deviations from these predictions, but these predictions are probabilistic. And so this might make you think that the universe is indeterministic. But this isn't agreed upon. So Albert Einstein, in thinking about quantum mechanics, famously said, God does not play dice. Okay? And so a collaborative of his at Princeton back then, David Bohm, came up with a metaphysical theory for quantum mechanics, according to which it's deterministic after all, because there are hidden factors beyond those invoked in the wave equation, which render all events deterministic. But there are also indeterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics. Maybe the most famous one is nowadays is the one that was developed by Italian scientists Girardi, Rimini, and Weber, called the GRW interpretation of 1986, which really adds a probabilistic equation to the standard quantum dynamics, which renders at least according to them, which renders the universe fundamentally indeterministic. But the thing is, we don't know which of these interpretations is true. And there are multiple metaphysical interpretations of quantum mechanics, and some of them are indeterministic and some of them are deterministic. So we don't have a justification for believing in indeterminism from quantum mechanics, or at least not a sufficient justification for thinking that indeterminism is true. Now, another problem is that what quantum mechanics talks about is at a very fundamental level. So it talks about kind of micro events and not macro events, not big events like human actions or the neural correlates of human actions. And so there's also this project that the famous physicist Sir Roger Penrose is involved in, namely trying to show that quantum indeterminacy, so-called, percolates up. So significant indeterminacy at the fundamental level can percolate up through certain kinds of mechanisms to the level of human action, or the neural correlates of human action. And he suggested in the 80s that there's these things in the brain called microtubules, which kind of propagate that indeterminism to a higher level. But that's hotly contested, and most people reject it now. Okay, but what Kant was worried about was this, that even if we can establish indeterministic agent causation, or at least if we can show that that's coherent, can we reconcile indeterministic agent causation with the laws of nature? And you might think it's not really possible if the laws of nature are deterministic. So suppose that dualism is true and that I've got libertarian free will of the agent causal sort, but my body is still governed by deterministic laws. So at some point, the action becomes physical, right? And so even if my choice is not causally determined by prior events, the scientific conception of the body is as of a physical thing that is governed by deterministic laws. Okay? So how can the deterministic laws be maintained as governing the physical world if we adopt that picture of human action? So you might think that's not really possible. And I also argue back in 2001 that it doesn't really help if the laws are probabilistic, because I think our conception of agent causation isn't the conception of a kind of causation governed by probabilistic laws. Rather, it's the conception of an agent not governed by any laws at all. Okay? So then the same sort of problem arises, namely that how do we reconcile an agent not governed by any laws at all with probabilistic or statistical laws that govern the human body? And I want to argue that that's also not a plausible conception. Now, one of the great advocates of agent causation in the 1960s, Roderick Chisholm, argued that if agent causation is true, then agent causation turns out that the agent cause cannot be reconciled with our picture of the laws of nature. So what he argued is that whenever an agent freely acts, we see a miracle in the physical world. So the laws of nature, as we conceive of them, are violated, whether they're indeterministic and statistical or deterministic. So that's another possibility. And I know some agent causal libertarians in the United States have this sort of view. But that renders agent causation subject to empirical disconfirmation, right? So if when free agents act and we do all the checking we can possibly do, and we don't find any violations of the laws of nature or exceptions to the laws of nature, it gives us reason to think that we're not really agent causes. Although I suppose it also holds out the possibility of confirmation of agent causal libertarianism. You know, if we do the right sorts of experiments and find that whenever agents act, you know, the laws of nature as we know them are contravened, then maybe we'll have some evidence for agent causation. But at least as I understand it, so far we've not found any evidence of contraventions of laws of nature when agents act. So maybe that counts as some evidence against our being libertarian agent causes. Okay, so those are some of the concerns for libertarianism. Now, at this point, you might think that compatibilism is true, and I think that compatibilism is, or at least has been in the past, kind of a majority doctrine. Now, this is the view when it's applied to free will as the controlling action required for true attributions of basic desert. It's the view that if causal determinism is true, and if all of our actions are causally determined by factors beyond our control, when we knowingly do wrong, we can still deserve to be punished or blamed in ways that we experience as painful or harmful, and that desert is basic in the sense that it's not founded on some sort of deeper justification, such as a consequentialist or contractualist justification. So now you might think that, and my own intuition is that if somebody's causally determined by factors beyond his control to act as he does, and he acts very badly, it'd be unfair to treat him as if he deserved, in a fundamental sense, pain or harm for what he's done. Now, compatibilists disagree with this. And so the question is, how do we argue against compatibilists on this score? Well, one strategy, and it's a strategy that I've developed in the past, is to use a manipulation argument. So you might think that there's no principal difference that's relevant to basic desert moral responsibility attributions between an agent who's causally determined, say, by neuroscientists to act as he does, and an agent who's causally determined by nature, by the past and the laws of nature to act as he does. So in my little scenario, we have this game here called Clue, in which there are these various characters who can kill each other and then get caught. And so we've got Plum, who's his professor in my scenario, who kills White for some egoistic reason. Suppose that he stands to get an inheritance if White dies. So so what I imagine is I imagine a manipulation case in which neuroscientists. So suppose that Plum, absent the neuroscientists' manipulation, would not have killed White. Suppose that Plum has some egoistic reasons for killing White and some moral reasons for not doing so. And suppose that had there been no intervention on the part of the neuroscientists, he wouldn't have killed White. But the neuroscientists want White dead. So what they do is they manipulate his brain remotely. It turns out that that's possible now through this process called optogenetic remote manipulation, which they work on at various places. At Cornell, there's some people who have patented such a device for remotely manipulating people's brains. Anyway, it turns out not to be just a science fiction scenario. I can show you the patent that my colleagues here at Cornell have filed for to create such a device. Okay, so imagine that the neuroscientists at this point kind of manipulate Plum by making his egoistic desires a bit stronger than they are, okay? And as a result, they predict with absolute certainty that he's going to kill White, because now his egoistic desires overwhelm his moral desires. Now, what do you think? Is he moral? Now, suppose that all the other, compatibilists have proposed all these different conditions for moral responsibility, such as like rationality. John Fisher's done that. That you can endorse your will to perform the action at a higher level by means of what Harry Frankfurt called second-order desires. Now, suppose all of those compatibilist conditions that have been proposed are in fact satisfied in the case of Plum, but the neuroscientists manipulate him by ramping up his egoistic desires, as a result of which they can predict with absolute certainty that he'll kill White, and he does kill White. Okay? So what do you think? Does he deserve basically to be pained or harmed, or punished or blamed in a way that he would experience as painful or harmful as a result of his having performed this action? Now, I want to say no. Okay? Now you'll see Carolina Sartoria in the next talk wants to say that he still basically deserves pain or harm. And Michael McKenna, her colleague at Arizona, also holds this view. But anyway, so I can't convince everybody, but it's my sense that if Plum's action has this particular history, if it's manipulated in this particular way by the neuroscientist, so that he would not have performed this action had he not been manipulated, I say he's not morally responsible in this basic desert sense. Okay, so if you're convinced by that, then I want to say that you can come up with some in-between cases. So you can imagine that are closer to the kind of ordinary deterministic case. So you can imagine that all the manipulation takes place at the beginning of Plum's life. So the philosopher Leibniz, he says that human beings are these, he calls them spiritual automata. And so God kind of programs them at the beginning of their lives to perform all the actions that they perform, to have all the thoughts that they think. Okay? So imagine that Plum is one of these people, as opposed to somebody who's manipulated at the time of the action or just before the time of the action by the neuroscientists. So then you might say, here's what I want. And then in a third case, I imagine somebody's manipulated by kind of the strict upbringing of a particular community to act as he does. And the fourth case is the ordinary case in which the agent is causally determined by the past and the laws. And so what I want to say is that there are no differences relevant to basic desert moral responsibility between that first case, which involves that local manipulation at the time of the action, and the Leibnizian case in which all the determination takes place at the beginning of the agent's life. Because after all, how can a time lag, how can that make a difference to true basic desert attributions? And then I want to say there's no difference between the case in which the God does the manipulation at the beginning of the agent's life and a case in which the community does the manipulation throughout the agent's life. And then in the final case, we have a situation in which the past and the laws do the determining. So I want to say that there are no differences between any two adjacent cases that can justify the claim that Plum is not responsible in the earlier case, but morally responsible in the later case. And so I want to say that the conclusion is that Plum is not morally responsible in the basic desert sense in any of these cases, and that the best explanation for this is that he's causally determined by factors beyond his control to act as he does in each, okay? Which is the anti-compatibilist conclusion. Okay, there have been a number of responses. I mentioned Michael McKenna and Carolina Sartoria. And so what they want to argue is that you can take the four cases forward and backward, right? So you can say, hey, look, it's pretty clear that Plum isn't morally responsible in that first case. And so that non-responsibility transfers all the way to the ordinary case. But you can go backwards too, right? You can say that it's pretty clear that Plum is morally responsible in the ordinary deterministic case. But because there are no differences between adjacent cases that are relevant to the basic desert moral responsibility, we should conclude that that Plum is morally responsible in that first manipulation case. Okay, and so we've had a big fight about this, but I still want to go my way. You can ask about that in the Q&A if you'd like. Okay, so here we have a set of arguments, one against event causal and agent causal libertarianism, and one against compatibilism. And it turns out that the only view left standing, if these arguments are in fact decisive, is the position that's skeptical about free will, that denies that we have the sort of free will required for basic desert moral responsibility. Now, this view has been held by people in the past. I think it's actually held by the Buddhist Indian philosopher Shantideva in the 9th century, but it's certainly held by Spinoza, so the 17th century philosopher. And so Spinoza was also concerned about the charge that we really can't live a moral life if we don't believe in the sort of free will at issue. Okay, and that's a pretty common presupposition. But Spinoza, in fact, in his famous posthumous book, The Ethics, says some really good things about our not believing in this sort of free will. So he says, for example, this doctrine contributes to the social life insofar as it teaches us to hate no one, to disesteem no one, to mock no one, to be angry at no one. Okay? So let me choose anger as the target emotion here. If people are causally determined to act as they do by factors beyond their control, do we have sufficient reason to be angry with them? Now, it turns out, so Spinoza thinks we don't. And so he thinks that the life of a free will skeptic is a non-angry life. I'm not quite sure I want to sign on to that. But maybe there's a certain kind of anger that's undermined by if free will skepticism is true. So the philosopher Strawson talks about resentment, which is moral anger at someone for wronging you, and indignation, which is moral anger at someone for wronging someone else. And you might think that these kinds of anger, these kinds of moral anger, presuppose basically deserved pain or harm. So you might think that when you're angry at someone if you're indignant with someone or resentful with someone for the wrong that he or she has performed, you might think that that anger has a certain kind of presupposition. Okay? Now, there's a theory of the emotions that goes back to the Stoics that says that emotions have cognitive presuppositions or belief presuppositions. So you might think that if you're angry with someone in this way, then by virtue of being angry, you believe that the person basically deserves pain or harm for the wrong that he or she has knowingly committed. Okay, so that's possibility. And then I think there's going to be a reason for the free will skeptic to try to avoid indignation and resentment. And then the question is, like, can you still blame people, right? How do you deal with wrongdoing? That's what this whole book is about. This new book, it's called, Wrongdoing and the Moral Emotions. How can we deal with wrongdoing if we have that skeptical view? Well, so a lot of people think that blame, for example, blame necessarily has to involve anger. So my colleague David Shoemaker, for example, argues in a recent article that the blameworthy is the very same thing as the anger worthy. So if you're blameworthy, you're worthy of anger, expressed moral anger. I want to say that's not quite right. I think that, maybe some kinds of wrongdoing are anger worthy, but like one of the roles I have over here at Cornell is as an administrator. And if you're an administrator at a university, and if you get angry at people for the minor wrongs that they commit, I think it doesn't work very well, because then they think you're, not the right kind of person for the job. Okay? And I think it's also true of like teachers and parents. When the kids do wrong in sort of a minor way, it's often just more effective not to express anger, but rather to confront the child and present the child with reasons for behaving differently in the future in a non-angry way. So I want to say that the blameworthy isn't the same thing as the anger worthy, but rather that the blame is the protest worthy. Right? So if you're blameworthy, then you merit moral protest. Okay? And some people think, like Pamela Hieronymi thinks, that moral protest necessarily involves anger, but I don't think so. Okay, so I think there's a nice free will skeptical account of blame as moral protest. And another concern people have had is about criminal punishment, whether there's going to be an adequate theory of dealing with criminals if free will skepticism is true. And let me see very quickly, so you guys have some time for task questions, give you my view of that. So what I think is that the right sort of view of dealing with criminals, it's actually set out by Daniel Farrell from Ohio State in the Phil Review in 1985, and a teacher of mine, Warren Quinn at UCLA, according to which the right to punish is based on the right to self-defense and defense of others. Okay? And so, so just as you have, and I want to say that this also holds in the case when if people aren't deserving of blame or praise for their wrongdoing. And here there's a nice analogy to quarantine. So we think that carriers of very dangerous diseases are legitimately quarantined to protect society, even if they're not morally responsible for being carriers of those diseases. And I think that we can say the same thing true of people that are habitual criminals. So even if they're not morally responsible for being habitual criminals, it's as legitimate to quarantine them, so to speak, as it is to quarantine non-responsible carriers of dangerous diseases such as COVID-19. Okay? And I think that there's a certain amount of deterrence that view results in that can amount to an adequate foundation for the right sort of treatment of criminals. I also want to say, I also want to add in like rehabilitation and reintegration as aims for the criminal justice system. And I think that's obviously consistent with free will skepticism. Okay, so that's my view in a nutshell. The arguments against again, let me quickly recap. The notion of free will, I think, is the one that's contested, is the control and action required for true attributions of basic desert. There's a disappearing agent argument against event causal libertarianism, kind of a reconciliation with physics argument against agent causal libertarianism, and a manipulation argument against compatibilism. Then the key question is, can we live without the conception of ourselves as free in the basic desert involving sense? And I want to say yes. Two key points here is that we have a forward-looking account of moral responsibility, where blame is fundamentally moral protest, and the blameworthy is the protest-worthy and not the anger-worthy. And we have a notion of criminal punishment that we can found not on basic desert as retribution does, but rather on the right to self-defense and defense of others. Okay, thank you.